Hi, Ann. How are you?
Hi, Glenn. I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. This is indeed Glenn Loury. Glenn Show here, bloggingheads.tv. I'm talking with Ann Althouse, who is Emerita Professor of Law at the University of Wisconsin and a frequent contributor at Blogging Heads to my show, among others. And a contrarian. I don't know if you'll accept that, Ann, but that's my impression. My impression is that you take positions that are both defensible and rarely taken on certain issues. And it's really fun to talk with you for that reason.
Okay. I think a lot of times I'm not really taking a position, but I'm talking about other people's positions, and people infer that I'm taking a position and get mad at me in ways where I'm not really even doing what they think I'm doing. So
Right.
I'm just a sly trickster.
Well, I guess that makes us fellow travelers then, because I often find myself in that position. For example, and this is our subject today, Donald J. Trump, President of the United States, who, after a hard-fought, bruising, bitter campaign, he won election November 8th, 2016, a day that will live in infamy for many people. And so now he becomes president. And in the aftermath of that political earthquake of his winning that election, there's been just a lot of back and forth and a lot of consternation. There's been resistance and protest and argument, and we must not normalize. And I have found myself, I confess it to you and to anybody else who's listening, in the position of scratching my head and saying, what are people talking about? There was an election, whatever one may have thought about it. There was an outcome. There really isn't any doubt about the outcome of the election. This is the president. You don't have to agree with everything that he wants to do, or for that matter, with anything that he wants to do. But the idea that we must not normalize his election is, I think, this is just me, Glenn Loury. Please tell us what you think. I think it's absurd. I think it's dangerous. I think it's self-indulgent. I think it's a little kind of immature. I think it tries to continue into the governance phase the same postures that people were free to adopt during a campaign. I think it's disrespectful of the voters who elected this man. And I think it is also, in some ways, showing contempt for the office that he occupies, quite apart from the person who might happen to be occupying it. So, I'm out there right now saying, of course, normalize. And yes, give him a chance. What do you mean give him a chance? Give us a chance. That is, give the United States of America a chance. What do you mean you don't want him to succeed? Of course you want him to succeed. That's ridiculous. I don't know. I find myself like odd person out, especially on a college campus, saying Donald Trump is president. We don't have to agree with everything, or for that matter, anything that he wants to do, but he is president. Let's get behind that and let's move on. Let's see what we can do, given that he's president. You don't want him to be reelected? Fight against his reelection. I have no problem with that. But stop with all this resistance, protest, trying to pull the House down because the election didn't come out the way that you wanted it last November. What do you think?
Well, I think the dialogue needs to go on, and that protests and conversations about the particular policies should go on. And maybe it's hard to say, well, you should protest, but just the right amount. But I certainly think I agree with everything that you say, and I think it's weird and shocking that that should be considered an extreme position in your university setting, because really the foremost principle should be democracy. Presumably we believe in democracy, and that means we have the big fight. It goes on for years. There's all of this focus on the election. The election finally occurs. I think after that, we're entitled to go back to our normal lives and expect government to take place, and for the person who got elected to then have the power to exercise it, subject to criticism when he does particular things. But this resistance to the entire election is antithetical to democracy. It makes it seem as if the people who purport to believe in democracy were really just saying, I believed in democracy because I thought I was going to win. I was so sure I was going to win, and now that I see that I haven't won, I'm going to pretend democracy doesn't really count, or I'm going to subordinate it to the principle of my party and my policies winning. But that's not democracy at all.
Okay, so you can imagine what some of the pushback on this will be. This is pushback against what you just said and what I opened this conversation was saying. It would be something like Russia. Okay, so the Russians hacked the election. They interfered in ways. There may have been collaboration. In any case, there's a bad odor about it. It would be something about, this guy. He's, say, for example, with respect to the so-called Muslim ban or the travel ban or the extreme vetting, depending on the terminology. He's a guy who wants to do things that are threatening to the very sort of core of who we are as a country. It would be a kind of, Hitler was elected too. I know it's a very, I'm just telling you what people are going to say. They're going to say the fact of democracy doesn't mean that we have to turn off our moral antennae. Democratic populist people can win elections who will nevertheless destroy institutions. Accepting of an electoral outcome simply because it has the majoritarian imprimatur isn't sufficient to preserve our liberties or to nurture the well springs of our very democratic institutions. This guy, free and fair election, but the last time you had that free and fair election, you elected somebody who undercut, et cetera, et cetera.
But isn't that my point? I mean, that's saying actually we don't believe in democracy when it turns out that who we are, just to say who we are, why isn't the answer to who we are, who won? We had a process that was set up to determine who we feel like being now in the next 4 years. A particular person was chosen. He said what he wanted to do, and those are the people who won. Now you can say, but I don't like those people, or those people, well, how does it make sense to say those people are not who we are? They won the election, the people that voted for Trump. But that's not who we are. Well, who are we if not the people who won in the election? What does that even mean to say? Now, I know that there's a long-standing political philosophy idea, and you also see it in modern America with titles like What's the Matter with Kansas, that the people don't really know what's good for them or don't really know what to think. And the real we is to be determined by betters who are going to come in and say who we are. And even if they feel that that's not who they are and they have a different idea, they really should be overridden by their betters who really have their true interests at heart, which they don't particularly understand. But to say that is to be anti-democratic. It's to say you don't believe in the American process. And if we as Americans are not that process and the belief in that election, then it really doesn't make much sense. If the Russians had actually hacked the election and affected the votes, that would be different. But the only accusation out there is that the Russians were successful in getting people to have different thoughts because the Podesta emails came out or something of that sort. But the Russians are always involved in trying to influence public opinion. That always happens, and we do that too. So I don't see what's especially different about what the Russians are purportedly doing here. I think that was just pulled out as a way to try to get Hillary to win in the first place, and then later to delegitimize Trump when she didn't win. And I think all of that is anti-democratic. I don't think the Russians changed the vote. Nobody is even arguing that. So that as leverage to throw out democracy is just ridiculous in my opinion.
Okay. Again, still pushing back. Not that I personally necessarily disagree with anything that you just said, but here I think are some of the arguments. Look, you're a law professor. You know that a constitutional republic, we're not a pure democracy. I mean, democratic is only one dimension of what we do. For example, the Bill of Rights, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to try to lecture a law professor about the Bill of Rights, but it's a very anti-democratic document. It basically says democratic majorities shall not infringe upon the liberties of persons in the following ways. There is no democratic justification for violating the Bill of Rights. To the extent that, for example, people and certain federal judges have come to this conclusion, see the travel ban that the president attempted to implement by executive order as inconsistent with, say, the First Amendment's non-establishment clause. To that extent, it doesn't matter if he got 90% of the electoral vote or the electoral college. Still, he ought not to be allowed to do what he wanted to do. And if he wanted to persist in doing it, or if he were to do something like tell a federal judge to go to hell, I'm going to do it anyway, I think you're wrong. then we have to defend our institutions contra democracy. It doesn't matter how high in the polls he might be. The kind of campaign that he conducted, people will say, is of the character. The kind of things that he has said and done over the years is of such a nature that this is not an idle concern. This anti-democratic impulse to protect our institutions from this populist demagogue who probably harbors racist and fascist, proto-fascist inclinations or tendencies, so they would say, justifying being out in the streets.
So what I would say to that is, first of all, of course, it's not a pure democracy. It's a constitutional structure, and that is set up to control bad things about democracy, which obviously the framers were very concerned about. And Trump won only in the Electoral College. He didn't even win the popular vote. So when we say democracy, that's kind of shorthand for saying the American system, the structure of choosing a president. And that is the process that we went through. So if you respect the Constitution, first of all, you respect that whole process of selecting the president, all the many other things we do in constituting the federal government. And then in addition to that, there are all the limitations on power. Those are important things. Now, if Trump were to overstep any of those limitations on executive power, and if Obama did, and I think there were a lot of arguments that Obama did that weren't taken all that seriously. Yeah. But the courts are, if people can bring a case of controversy, the federal courts will get involved and they'll apply whatever they see the law to be. We're having a Supreme Court confirmation hearing this week, so that's really very much in play. But obviously, to the extent that what Trump is choosing to do with, for example, immigration, if that violates some provision of the Constitution, the courts will let us know what they think about that, and that will govern. And I don't see Trump or Trump's supporters at all saying that the law shouldn't be followed. They may question whether the judges are doing a proper job of determining the law, but so far we've only had lower court decisions. It hasn't gone up to the Supreme Court. I don't think we're really seeing any indication that Trump wouldn't follow the orders. He did follow the order. He rewrote the executive order, and it's being relitigated, and we still haven't gotten to the Supreme Court. I think that Trump, like Nixon in the Watergate tapes case, is completely likely to accept whatever the judicial result is and not to defy the courts. There have been presidents long ago that would defy the courts, but it's pretty well settled in America, and people expect it and see it as part of the process that the courts will have their say and that will be taken as the final answer as to what constitutional law is, and the president will follow it. We saw Nixon hand over the tapes and not destroy them and so forth. That's what modern America has come to be, and I don't see anything about Trump or his followers that's fighting against that, except to the extent of the usual criticism of judges, which, by the way, was a big issue in the confirmation hearings this week. Should we criticize judges, or should we just treat them with complete respect and never impugn them? I think we should criticize judges. That's part of what we do. But we also accept the results when they finally do come out. And I don't see any indication that Trump isn't going to do that.
Okay, of course we should, and it wouldn't be anything new to Trump to criticize judges. I think every president has. President Obama, in fact, criticized the Supreme Court sitting right in front of him about the Citizens United, right at the State of the Union, with them sitting right there to their faces before hundreds of millions, or at least tens of millions of people. Mm-hmm. So that. But if, for example, there were to be, heaven forbid, a terrorist attack perpetrated by some refugee person who entered the country under circumstances that would have been precluded had the courts not blocked the implementation of President Trump's executive order. And if the president were to go around to Louisville and Orlando and other such places before crowds of tens of thousands and start lambasting these judges who have now blood on their hands. And if the Koch Industries Foundation or some other right-wing philanthropy were to start funding a blizzard of television commercials with Fox News allocating a lot of time to singling out individual judges with their photograph. You can see how this campaign would go. They have blood on their hands, and the president were to be fostering and promoting and abetting this. Don't you think that he would be behaving in a way that would have to raise very serious concerns? Whether he's acting extra constitutionally or not, I don't think we could say it's against the Constitution for him to criticize the judiciary, but it would be poisoning the well in a very profound way, would it not? It would be a very concerning use of his authority and potential impairment of the independence of the judiciary, or would it not? I mean, that's a hypothetical, but I wonder what you think about it.
I think if you look back, read Federalist 51 and that sort of thing, you have three branches of government, and they're supposed to have their interest in their own branch of government that they will defend, because it's in their interest to defend the power of their department, their branch of the government, right? The judiciary is another branch. The Congress is a branch, and they're all, and what's supposed to create this balance of power is that they will fight independently for their territory. They may aggrandize themselves or ask for more or argue for more or have a grand vision of how much power they have. We remember how Obama talked about his executive orders and things of that sort. So the president is doing that when he pushes back the judges, criticizing them and so forth, and the judges do a similar thing. That's the way it's supposed to work. And that vigor is everyone in their own branch arguing for their strength and having that pressure up against each other. So just laying back and saying, well, let the judges decide everything, that doesn't really work. I mean, there are some things prior to the Civil War that involved presidents who said, let the judiciary decide.
Yeah.
It didn't work out very well. So the idea that all should be trying to exercise their power capably and vigorously, and there will be some butting up against each other and some working it out that way. And some of that will be worked out depending on what the people see as right. Is that really the judicial role? Is that really the legislature's role? That's a continuing conversation that we're having. It's not ever going to be completely resolved. And there's something good about it remaining in this kind of tension or continuing fight among real people who are pursuing their interests and trying to perform their vision of what they think their branch's power is. A lot of times it causes the judges. You talk about the judges who might be afraid that they have blood on their hands if they go too far in the name of constitutional limitations, and it leads to some terrible terrorist attack. But judges are often strongly drawn not toward exercising more power, but toward judicial restraint, in part because they think this isn't the proper judicial role or some other branch, especially with respect to anything military or involving national security. They're likely to retreat into this judicial restraint position rather than to be putting themselves forward and saying, no, this is for us. So part of the dialogue really is about the judges defining what their proper role is. And they're often pulled over into judicial restraint. That's kind of part of their problem. By the way, Trump's sister is a federal judge, so I think he probably respects the federal judiciary.
I didn't know that, actually. I should have known that. You mentioned the judicial politics of the 1850s leading up to the Civil War. And I just came from a conference on Frederick Douglass, the life and times and writings and so forth. Read a lot of Frederick Douglass and a lot about this period in reaction to the Dred Scott decision and such. And I tell you, I mean, knowing what happened, knowing that when we get to 1861 and we get, to the South Carolina situation, the attack on federal property, and we get to this war, and 600,000 Americans are slaughtered in this war. The sense of foreboding that one has, reviewing the machinations back and forth, President Buchanan, this and that, Justice Taney, this and that. And and the conflagration that lies ahead. I mean, the sense of foreboding that I had on reviewing that period of American history was just overpowering. I mean, so many people did not handle their responsibilities very well. Anyway, that was just a comment. I wanted to put on the table an idea, and that is that, okay, we have the Constitution and we have the separate branches and they have their authorization and the respective articles that entitle them. But we also have to have, don't we, a kind of compact of forbearance and restraint and a kind of respect and so on that's not written in the law. It's more the spirit than the letter that allows for this system of formal stipulations to function well. So, for example, judicial restraint, judges leaving, not arrogating to themselves powers that don't properly belong to the judiciary. I don't know if that's anywhere in the Constitution. I'm not a lawyer. Is it the doctrines of some people who say that justices should leave political decisions to political branches and should merely try to understand what the law says and not go beyond it? More of a kind of literal textual tethering of justices and what they do. So that's a question. And also, doesn't anything like comparable to that apply to the populist branches vis-a-vis the judiciary? Someone runs for president in a country of 350 million people. They have scores upon scores of millions of supporters. They have a megaphone. Putting the judiciary in their sights and running for election against judges. I'm not saying it's against the law. I'm just saying it might not be the kind of practice that one wants to cultivate if one wants to keep the whole system. It can be a brittle system if one wants to keep it healthy. So there should be populist restraint in attacking on judges as well as judicial restraint in overstepping their bounds.
Yeah. What are the limitations on the judiciary? I mean, you can impeach the judges, you can amend the Constitution, you can try to appoint different judges, and you can cut back their jurisdiction. But the main pressure on them is just public opinion and criticism, praise and criticism. It affects them. They're human beings. But it's unknowable exactly what their role is. I mean, that's the subject that's being argued about. That's what the confirmation hearings this week have been about. I mean, it never ends. If you were in the field of constitutional law, you would just be part of an endless discussion about what this all is. Constitutional law professors tend to have opinions about some parts of the Constitution that should be enforced more and other parts that perhaps shouldn't be enforced at all. Things having to do with executive power, especially. You might think there should be deference to the executive, or that Congress could be able to delegate all of its power to the executive and just let the executive run everything. That's a popular opinion, or was a popular opinion during the Obama administration. Less popular when your guy isn't in. So there's a lot of hypocrisy. There's just a lot of humanity and an endless argument. That's
okay, so where are you on the Gorsuch, Merrick Garland? It was Merrick Garland's seat, I read in the New York Times this morning, that was stolen from him by Mitch McConnell and the Republicans in the Senate. And now Chuck Schumer, he won't mention that it's Merrick Garland's seat, but he says Justice Gorsuch is too friendly to corporations and too indifferent to the needs of ordinary people. Where have I heard that before? Yeah. Where do you come out
on
this?
Well, I mean, we've been engaged in something of a farce for a long time, ever since Judge Bork was voted down. Everybody's been able to see that revealing too much about yourself is giving fuel to the other side. And ever since Justice Souter was nominated and then turned out to be liberal, and Justice Kennedy who was the judge we got instead of Bork, he has turned out to be very moderate, or some people think too liberal over the years. Ever since then, presidents have been trying to put up someone where there's no material to use against him, but also where he won't be a Bork, but he can't be a Souter either. If you're a Republican, if you're conservative, you have to avoid both Bork and Souter. You don't want him to be so neutral seeming that you can't trust him to be conservative, but you don't want him to wear his conservatism on the outside to such an extent that there will be material to shoot him down. So, I mean, that's what Gorsuch is. That's what all of the justices have been that have been chosen since Bork. I mean, liberal presidents do it on the liberal side. So everybody knows that what we're going to get is somebody that looks like he has just fabulous, unimpeachable credentials. He went to the finest schools. Everyone thinks well of him. He's almost like not really a very distinctive person. We just don't have anything about him. But then at the same time, we have enough to know he's one of our people. And so the opponents, in this case, the Democrats in the Senate,
Yeah.
we know why Trump picked Gorsuch. He's a perfect pick. He has all the credentials. He seems totally upstanding. How can you possibly reject this person? But at the same time, they also know that he's conservative, and that's why he was picked, right? And of course the Democrats know that about him. They also know that if Hillary Clinton had been nominated, she would have picked somebody who was a reliable liberal. I mean, question whether she would have had to pick Merrick Garland because Obama already picked him. I mean, Obama picked somebody that was a little more centrist because Obama was facing what he ended up facing. But typically with Sotomayor and Kagan, I mean, come on. Everybody's doing the same thing. We all know what it is. And if you watch the confirmation hearings, I had trouble watching very much of it. I mean, I watched hours of it, but I didn't watch all of it because it's transparent what they're doing. Yeah. It's theater. And it's sort of the corner we painted ourselves into. It's very frustrating, but we know that's going to happen. A lot of it is just the problem that too much of constitutional law has become policy and political position. It really is too political, but maybe there's no way out of that. I don't know.
Were you outraged by the Senate Republicans refusing to hold hearings or whatever with Garland? You were not.
If the tables were turned, the same thing would have been done. You know that they were able to call that the Biden rule. Biden said the same thing at the end of the George W. Bush administration. We don't confirm anyone in the last year. So the Democrats took the same position. If the tables were turned, the same position would have been taken by the Democrats.
Okay.
Everyone knew that. Now, of course, the same thing would have been done by the Republicans that the Democrats did. They would have acted like it was an outrage. Yeah. So, I mean, to me, it's a bit of a comical farce. I understand why they're doing it. I know they have to do it, but it's political theater. And I'm not going to get dragged around by the emotional appeals of Chuck Schumer or whoever wants to act like something here is really happening. To me, what's happening is what you know is going to happen. It's what always happens. It's political theater. I understand why they do it. They have to do it for their people. But I'm just not in the audience of that particular theater.
Let me just say, you made reference to the Bork situation. And I was around at the Kennedy School of Government in the 1980s when Robert Bork was nominated. I'm not going to say I knew him, but I did meet him from time to time. I was a neoconservative intellectual. It was hard not to meet him. And I remember the speech that Ted Kennedy famously gave, if you confirm this judge, then people have to go to back alley abortions. The courthouse doors will be slammed on the fingers of the poor and so forth and so on, which I thought was outrageous demagoguery. But notwithstanding my somewhat right-of-center political orientation at the time, my main lament about Justice Bork's demise as a Supreme Court justice was that the man was just over-the-top brilliant. I knew his writings on antitrust law and policy because I'm an economist and I used to teach industrial economics. The man was a prodigious intellect. I mean, he was really a giant in my humble opinion, but I really don't think that's very controversial as far as a scholar of the law and of society. So we were deprived on political grounds of a substantive intellect. I'm not saying I could have endorsed every decision or position that he would have taken, but I think since the Supreme Court actually does have to parse some of the most important and fundamental issues that confront us as a society, having people of high IQ, I mean, I'm just going to put it directly, people who are brainy, people who are profound, is a good thing. I can
counter you on that. Okay. I think we might not want
We don't want smart judges?
Not the biggest genius. You know, some people are a little too smart for constitutional law. You might want something a little more ordinary and flat-footed and workmanlike, that if someone's too brilliant, like people talk about Judge Richard Posner here in the Seventh Circuit,
yes,
you know, as brilliant as you could possibly be, but there's a reason he doesn't get on the court. Now, I feel a little deprived that the very best people, the most interesting intellects, they don't make it through this filter. The person has to be kept like unusually clean. He can't really be much of a character. He can't say odd things and be misunderstood. He's got to be sort of reliable in an ordinary way that causes us to get people who are less colorful, less creative. But maybe that's what you want in a judge. Maybe you don't want someone too vivid. I know a few people who I think have extremely high IQs. Some of the smartest people I know are the ones I would actually least trust in a position of power. If I took out the 2 or 3 people I've known in my life who I think have the highest IQ, I would absolutely not put them in a position of trust. Let them write books. Let them speak and participate in the debate, but don't give them the final judgment power. I think you have to watch out for some of those people. Not necessarily Judge Bork, but it's not just a game of who's got the highest IQ. That some of those people you might want to put in. I think a university can be a sort of a nice holding pen for people who are in much trouble if we let them just bust out with their.
That's interesting. Yeah. Let me ask you something else. So, where are you on the travel ban? The constitutionality of it and the wisdom of it. This is the president's executive order limiting refugees from certain admission to the country from certain countries, and
if Trump had wanted to get it through legally and had put getting it through the court first, he wouldn't have done it the way he did. So his prime use of that issue was in the political debate. It was his main issue. And it seems to have gotten him elected. It got him all of that traction. It got him through his 16 opponents in the primaries. He got where he did because of that. Now it's coming back to bite him in the ass because he said, it's a Muslim ban. And now he wants to say it's not a Muslim ban. And what the courts who are deciding against him are doing is using that evidence that they have of his intent. So you may put a veneer of neutrality on it and say it's just from these countries that have a record of supporting terrorism, and these are the countries that Obama identified, et cetera, et cetera. But there's this additional point that what Trump said again and again was that he presented it as a Muslim ban, and so now he can't shake that. Well, but I don't know if he would have wanted to have done it otherwise. Maybe he doesn't even want this to go through. Maybe losing in the courts is beneficial to him politically. He's not changing what he's doing. So I don't know how that will ultimately work out. He's getting a certain amount of political traction out of it. And even though, the sort of eastern or coastal elites are able to keep sneering at him, he does have his constituency that won him the election. And those people responded to that. As to actually doing it, the courts are doing their work as they see it. Of standing in the way. There's a big question about whether the evidence of what he said during the election should be used. And I know a lot of people are saying that shouldn't count because then that would mean that Trump can't do something that Obama would have been able to do. The exact same executive order would have been enforceable and constitutional if Obama had done it, but it's not constitutional if Trump did it. But the reason it's not constitutional in the view of the courts that say it's not when Trump does it is because the question is, what is the real intent there? And if it's just a veneer on top of an intent to exclude Muslims, then that's regarded as discriminatory in a way that violates the Constitution. Well, there's a lot of questions in there, but I guess the main thing I want to say is that he used this idea politically. He's still using it politically. And whatever happens in the courts is kind of secondary perhaps to his interest.
Okay, so now I'm a lay person. I'm not a lawyer. I've said that already. The prospect that an action by the President of the United States would be precluded on constitutional grounds because of the person undertaking that action troubles me deeply. Okay, that's an ad hominem constitutional thing. Okay, the same action, the exact office, the exact action, but the man or woman taking the action is judged by a court to have had motives that are impure and therefore nullifying the action on constitutional grounds. The exact same action by somebody else. That puts the courts in the business of parsing what they understand to be based upon what? The evidence that Trump gave a speech during a campaign, the fact that Rudy Giuliani said something in an interview to a journalist. A court is going to constrain the exercise of the powers of office based upon an imputation of motive to the person happening to be occupying that office. That strikes me as a very odd thing, quite apart from the merits of this particular case, is a very odd thing to be doing. Campaigns are one thing and governance is another. Are we really going to use evidence? People say a lot of things during campaigns. If he declares to me that's not my motive, why am I not taking him at his word?
Well, I mean, this is sort of the question of what is evidence. For example, just to change to a different subject that where it's more clear why we have to do this. If you talk about a policy that has a disparate racial impact,
Yeah.
it doesn't violate equal protection unless there's an intent to discriminate. In other words, if there's a policy that you're adopting, maybe some spending or tax policy or some criminal provision that is neutral on its face but has a disparate impact,
Yeah.
it doesn't violate equal protection unless you can prove intent to discriminate. You actually want to hurt this group. Now, what counts as evidence? So you might say, well, how can we ever know what was intended? But courts do look at intent, and then evidence is evidence. Evidence is anything that makes a fact an issue more or less likely. Anything could be evidence. It's a question of whether there's enough evidence. So is there enough evidence here? So I think intent is something that can make the difference in whether something's constitutional or not. And it's always hard to know what's in someone else's mind, but if intent is sometimes going to be an issue, and obviously it is in law, then the question becomes, what is good enough evidence? And now we can have an argument about whether this evidence is enough.
It just feels to me like a court is placing itself in the position of the electorate. There was a contest. One contestant said, my opponent's values, motives, beliefs, and fundamental premises are wrong for our country. Vote for me. Okay? She loses. Now, the person who was alleged to have, I mean, who can demonstrate that Donald Trump is anti-Muslim? I don't believe that that can be demonstrated. At least I'm not convinced that Donald, let me just say it directly for everybody out there who's going to get angry about it. I haven't seen anything to convince me that Donald Trump's motivations are based upon some kind of antipathy toward the Muslim religion. He's against radical Islamic terrorism. That's not the Muslim religion. So there was a contest in which the contestants took different positions about what to do and about the character of their opponents. That contest was resolved by the voters. Now a court is going to come along and say, aha, the voters may have elected this person president, but his exercise of the powers of office have to be conscribed by our interpretation of what we think his character and values are based upon what? The evidence from a campaign? I object.
Didn't you sort of contradict yourself? Because earlier in this conversation, you said even though we elected him and that was democracy, there are also constitutional limits on power, yes. And the courts are going to apply those. So you can be fully accepting of the democratic process by which he won, and also accepting of the court's role in applying the law and in determining what the law is. And so that's the question.
It's the basing of their determination on an imputation of motive to the person, evidence for which is cherry-picked from a political campaign that I'm objecting to. It's not the courts reviewing the actions of the office. It's that they come to the conclusion about this occupant of the office that this action is disqualified, whereas some other occupant about whom they would make some inference about his motives from a different campaign in a different set of evidence is not foreclosed from acting in this way. That's what I'm objecting to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that will ultimately be the position that wins, especially once Gorsuch gets nominated. But I think if it gets confirmed. But I think maybe if Merrick Garland had been confirmed and it was 5-4 going the other direction, maybe the other position would win. I mean, that's sort of troubling to think that it all depends on that. But isn't that right? I mean, intent can matter in whether something's constitutional or not. The Constitution limits what the president can do. And intent is something that is proved by evidence. And we have to assess what that evidence is. And what do we count as evidence? Well, evidence can be anything. And Trump, in fact, did make a lot of very strong statements. But, you know, I do agree with you. I don't believe that Trump is anti-Muslim. I don't think he's a bigot or that he has hatred. And I think that his opponents are being extremely heavy-handed in saying that about him. I don't know where that will ultimately go, but that was all part of this idea of keeping him non-normal and abnormalizing him and making him seem like some kind of monster. I think that process is kind of waning, and that it sort of failed and is kind of ending this idea that he's just a big hateful person. But Now it's moved into the courts. And if it's the courts that are saying, this was only done out of hate for Muslims, it's a very strong thing for the court to say. And I don't think that's ultimately going to be upheld. So I don't know. I think in the end, maybe Trump will win because this public political outcry, he's a racist, he's a bigot, he's anti-Muslim, turned into something that petered out in the courts as the courts tried to use it as a component in a legal analysis and kind of brought it into the sphere of when we start asking what courts should do and how much a court should stand in the way of a president who, after all, is trying to protect national security, and he's in a realm where his power should be strongest. So I kind of think this move into the courts, despite these losses he suffered, is kind of denaturing or weakening this argument that had a lot of political traction a while back, which was Trump is this big hateful person. Right. It's now turned into something more technical that's a component of a legal analysis. And that is stirring up all our sense of, well, are courts really competent or appropriate to be taking over the field of national security? And at any moment, there could be some terrible attack. And that would completely skew the way people thought of it.
Yeah, heaven forbid. Okay, so we're reviewing the legal landscape in the era of Trump, and I can't help but say to you, Professor of Law, Attorney General, the Office of Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, Alabama, Eric Holder. So we go from the world of Eric Holder and sorry, gosh, I'm blocking on the name of our most recent Attorney General, the woman who met with Bill Clinton.
Loretta Lynch.
No, is that her? Loretta Lynch. Okay, forgive me. I don't follow these things as closely as I should. We go from Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch on the one hand to Jeff Sessions, a hard-fought confirmation battle for him. He prevailed. He's now the Attorney General of the United States. What are your views about the implications for the conduct of the Justice Department under this new dispensation?
Well, a lot of hate was thrown at Jeff Sessions. I think a lot of that was very unfair. Did you know Jeff Sessions back in the...
I never knew Jeff Sessions. Never met Jeff Sessions. I, of course, remember, again, from the 80s where he was shot down as a federal judge nominee.
What did you think of that? Did you think that was fair, or did you think
No, I didn't think it was fair. Honestly, I didn't even think it was fair in the 80s, and that was 30 years ago. Yeah. I mean, I thought, first of all, he was said to have used the N-word against somebody.
Somebody said he did. I mean, that's a very powerful thing that, it was just between me and him, and I heard him say it. So I'm going to destroy his career by saying that he said that?
That's Clarence Thomas-esque. And I'll get myself in trouble, but that's in that same bailiwick as far as I'm concerned. And then it was that he brought a case prosecuting people for voting law infringement. And I don't know all the particulars in detail, but the fact that he, as a U.S. attorney, brought this case against people who were alleged to be civil rights martyrs or heroes and whatnot, and they were just trying to get black people to vote, those were, as I recall, the main objections to him. And I didn't find them particularly compelling. I mean, look, he's a Southerner. He's a conservative. He's a Republican. He may have even been a Democrat in those years, but I reckon he was probably a Republican. And I can understand why you would, NAACP or ACLU or whatever, would object to him. I see why you think he wouldn't be a good person to be on the court. But the idea that he's a racist, that he's unfit based upon some profound character flaw, I wasn't convinced of that in the 1980s, and certainly recycling those 30-year-old arguments today sounded completely absurd to me, but, that's just me.
Yeah, me too. I mean, it's sort of what they have to do, similar to the political theater around the Supreme Court nominee. They have to make these charges, and if they go too far, they lose their credibility, the Democratic Party. But this idea that he's this terrible man and that we need to destroy him, there's something... I don't know. I think fair-minded people feel a little squicked out by that there's something evil going on.
It raises a big issue, it seems to me, though. I mean, one of the issues with Sessions is the Voting Rights Act and the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. In that case, I believe it's Shelby County, which, as I understand it, basically holds that if you want to single out certain jurisdictions, certain states for special treatment under the Voting Rights Act in terms of pre-clearance of their administration of voting laws, then you need current evidence
Right.
that those states deserve special treatment, not relying upon a history that's 50 years old about those states. Now, that seemed reasonable to me. I'm sorry, I'm black. I believe in black people being able to vote without encumbrance. But the idea that you were going to hold the southern states, the states of the old Confederacy, forever in a special position, that their administration of the voting laws would be reviewed by the Justice Department or by a federal court in Washington, D.C., in a manner different from other jurisdictions, based upon the fact that in 1950, they behaved in a certain way?
Well, they used the act was set up with a calculation from numbers that are from 1972.
Okay.
And they reenacted it, and they kept the 1972 point for looking at who's going to be treated differently. And you could say that it was a careful crafted use of power originally when they came up with the calculation, and they looked for the states that had a record of doing sneaky things to hurt the voting rights, and that they did need more supervision. But later, when they reenacted, why did they still do it that way? Why didn't they use newer numbers? Or, why were they singling out those few states? I mean, I know that the argument was because the Voting Rights Act has worked, and this preclearance approach has been effective in keeping those bad states from going bad again. But how did we know they were bad, that they were still bad, or that they would do that? What was the evidence? I mean, it's an issue of evidence. What evidence did they have? And to treat some of those states differently from others was an unusual thing to be doing that was maybe justified at one time when sneaky methods really were used. But many people think sneaky methods are still being used, like voter ID.
Yeah.
But still, why does that treat some states adopting voter ID are going to be treated differently from other states based on a calculations that's pegged to statistics from 1972?
Well, it's similar in some ways. It's similar to the issue about Trump's intent with the travel ban. We know what kind of person he is. We know what kind of jurisdictions these are.
We know who you are.
This is Alabama. This is Mississippi. This is Georgia. This is South Carolina. We've been there. We know. We've got a lot of evidence.
We know who you are. These are stereotypes, of course, right? We really love our stereotypes, and we think you Southerners are the racists, not like us in the North. Well, I mean, that's kind of a strange way to legislate. There's something abnormal about that kind of legislation, and the court said you couldn't do it anymore. And a lot of political mileage has been gotten out of that opinion, that terrible racist opinion. And very few people know what it really says. There are those cases that are picked out and used politically. The other one that's big these days is Citizens United about spending money on speaking.
Corporations are people.
No, well, it doesn't really say that. It says
okay, that's my non-lawyer's rendition of what I thought the bottom line was.
People's heads to think, the conservatives are for the big guy or they're against the little guy. But the idea that free speech is about equalizing speech, and people shouldn't be allowed to spend too much money on their speech. Congress has the power to hold speech down so that some people don't speak more than others. I mean, if you say, well, everyone's entitled to speak as an individual, but if you start forming groups and maximizing or amplifying your speech by forming a group, such as a corporation or a union or an organization, well, then you're different, and Congress is allowed to cut you down, because only the government should be able to aggregate itself into such a huge entity that it can speak more powerfully than anyone else.
So you're defending the court's judgment in Citizens United?
Absolutely, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's misrepresented so much. I mean, the campaign finance law didn't cover corporations like the New York Times, but the New York Times is a corporation. The idea that the government could limit when and how you could speak about an election, and that's freedom of speech.
It's not in its capacity as a corporation, but rather in its capacity as a newspaper that it's protected.
It's an entity. It's a corporate entity. It's a newspaper. It's a business. It's not an individual. It's a set of individuals who happen to have organized their work in the corporate form. And those are people doing something.
So you're not buying this argument from Bernie Sanders, but from many, many others, that there's just too much money in American politics and that it distorts. I was colleagues with Martin Gillens. He's a political scientist at Princeton. very well known, Gilens, for some of his careful empirical studies of whose interests actually get reflected in the legislation that gets passed. And it turns out that if you're just Joe Schmo, if you're just a middling person somewhere and you have opinions about it, it's very unlikely that legislation is responsive to your opinions. But if you're, Koch brothers or somebody like that, you have opinions about things. I mean, he tries to identify empirically the extent to which the legislatures are responsive to those opinions, and they are much more responsive. And the mechanism that is campaign finance that is alleged to facilitate this disproportionate or unequal responsiveness of government institutions to the desires of the people. This doesn't worry you at all?
It worries me, but I don't think it's a basis for cutting back free speech or changing the meaning of the First Amendment. I mean, it's the argument, what does the First Amendment mean? I think people can spend money to promote their speech. Citizens United wasn't about giving money to the candidate. It was disseminating your own speech, spending your own money to speak. That's what newspapers do. That's what organizations do. I mean, I think that should be considered bedrock free speech. And you can have things about disclosure of who's giving money, who's spending money. You have all of the political debates, such as Bernie Sanders speaking about how there's too much money in politics. I think that that's heard and that's effective to some extent. I mean, look what just happened in the election. Hillary Clinton spent so much more money than Donald Trump.
Yeah.
She had all the money. And then there was Jeb Bush, who had all the money. He was going to just waltz into the nomination. Everybody would just give up like Scott Walker did.
Yeah.
Because he had $100 million or something. Well, it didn't work. So I think some of these arguments about how money is everything, I think speech is closer to being everything. And Donald Trump, for all his money, did what he did with speech. He did it with vivid, effective speech. He figured out how to do something with speech, and he just went around to a lot of rallies and kept speaking and affecting people, and those people spread things by word of mouth, and those were very popular rallies. That was very old-timey stuff. So I'd like to hear some of the analysis be directed at what actually just happened in the last election.
Oh, those are very good points. And I'm also thinking here that Barack Obama outspent his opponents, McCain and Romney, in those two elections by a substantial amount. Mm-hmm. And he also refused to take public funds in the 2008 election cycle because he knew that he had a huge advantage.
To get more money. Yeah.
And, et cetera. So those things are worth taking on board. Well, okay, Ann, I don't know about you, but I've got a life beyond conversation. Very good to see you on the screen and talk with you again. And we'll find something else to be contrarians about in the near future. Okay?
Okay. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.